The Secret of the Conde Hermanos, Chapter 9. Originally, Paloma had planned to drive straight home to Carmel after taking care of her business in Los Angeles, but now, after seeing Petal's portrait, she felt compelled to give the matter more thought. Ultimately, she decided to take a leisurely drive home and reflect along the way. After all, Petal had been the closest thing she'd ever had to a cousin, or to a sister for that matter. They had grown up together and were, in fact, exactly the same age. Just as she loved to hear her mother recount the story of her own birth, she had loved to hear her aunt tell the story of Petal's. I simply went to the animal shelter, Aunt Blanquita had explained each time, and said, "I want the next dog you're about to euthanize." Out they came with a sickly black puppy, too weak to walk, in their arms. So much the better, I thought, as I knew your Uncle Carlos could heal her in his clinic. And so it was in no time that she was the picture of health and an integral member of our family. "Do you see how destiny works, Paloma?" she would always ask at the end of the story. Destiny smiled on Petal in her time of need, and Petal knew. She never took it for granted, and that is why she's always there for us. Petal would follow us to the ends of the earth if need be. Paloma by this time was crossing the county line and entering Ventura. It was September, and the sunlight was falling in that enchanted way it always fell at that time of year, diffused and in an angle such that one could actually sense the turning of the earth subtly on its axis. She noticed on her right that Neptune's Net, a popular destination for weekend motorcyclists, was already overflowing this Sunday with bikes parked outside and patrons sitting cheek by jowl on the front patio having breakfast. To her left, she could see the shoulder of the highway was lined with parked cars and surfers in various stages of undress, struggling into their wetsuits before joining the legions of their kind already sitting atop their boards in the water, stoically waiting for the next wave. Nothing has changed, she mused, suddenly transported back to her girlhood, except, of course, for the fact that she was now in the driver's seat instead of in the back with Petal. She decided it was time for some music. They had always listened to music when she drove up with her aunt and uncle, and she had enjoyed listening almost more, really, to their anecdotes about the musicians themselves, most of whom they knew personally. "I remember," Uncle Carlos had once recounted while listening to a Brazilian CD, "when I was studying with Laurindo Almeida at his music school in Hollywood, I would always arrive early so as never to keep the maestro waiting, and each time I would hear another student painfully practicing scales in the next room. At least I would console myself. I am not the worst student at this school. Someone else is actually far slower than I am." Imagine my surprise when one morning it was Laurindo Almeida himself I chanced to see emerging from that other room. "I'll be right with you, Carlitos. I always like to arrive early so as to do my warm-up scales before our class." And it was from that experience, he chuckled, that I learned the importance of warming up slowly, no matter how accomplished you are. "Yes, Paloma," he called back to her, "that was the most important thing Laurindo Almeida ever imparted to me. And he did it by example, no less. The best way to teach. Am I right, Petal?" Paloma smiled as a long-forgotten memory came rushing back. Surely she must have brought along a Brazilian CD, preferably Laurindo Almeida, for that was the music she suddenly craved to hear. As they approached Santa Barbara, her aunt would ceremoniously declare, "Carlos, it is time for lunch," which always meant one thing: a stop at El Encanto, where Carlos and Blanquita had honeymooned. It was a charming historic hotel that rambled gracefully in the foothills near the Mission on a scenic road, often referred to as the Santa Barbara Riviera because it boasted comparable views of a not dissimilarly breathtaking coastline. Of course, Paloma realized, feeling quite hungry as she, in her haste to return, had skipped breakfast. I must stop there for lunch. Alone at a table for one on the patio was not quite the same, but she could swear she felt the old familiar pressure of Petal leaning against her cap under the table, reminding her that if she would drop a morsel, it would not go unheeded. She obeyed her old instinct to reward Petal's entreaties, as she had always done in her childhood, and was struck by the thought that perhaps some phantom aspect of dear Petal lingered there and was enjoying some phantom aspect of the hamburger medium rare that she had dropped in her honor. After lunch, her aunt and uncle liked to linger over coffee while she and Petal took a walk on the hotel grounds. The large rectangular reflecting pool full of water lilies had been their favorite place, to which they would head directly, and upon returning they would wait for Carlos and Blanquita in the old-fashioned canopied lawn gliders that sat on the grass just outside the restaurant. She found retracing these old steps was comforting, and afterward was hard-pressed to lift herself out of the hypnotic rhythm of the lawn glider to get back on the road. Eventually she rose to the task and headed north out of Santa Barbara through the Gaviota Pass with its perpetually gusty winds. As she drove through the narrow two-lane tunnel cut through solid rock, and in which as a child she had always held her breath and made a wish, she caught herself doing the exact same thing again. Funny, but after all the intervening years, her wish hadn't actually changed much. She had wished then that time could stand still, and that Petal, whose chin would invariably be resting on her lap, could live forever. And now she wished, not unlike her aunt many years ago, that if nothing else, Petal could at least return to her, perhaps in keeping with her uncle's theory, as an even more perfect expression of love. Shortly thereafter, she found herself in what was now considered wine country, a fairly recent development in the scheme of things. None of the vast vineyards that stretched along either side of the highway had been there when she was a child. Only miles, as far as the eye could see, of gnarled oak trees, bucolically dotted with the occasional cattle herd seeking shelter in the arms of their most welcome and benevolent shade. How had that seemingly timeless landscape become uprooted, quite literally, in such a short span of time? Well, so much for time standing still, she realized. No, it was visibly moving forward, and at a much faster rate than she could have ever previously anticipated. By now, she was approaching San Luis Obispo and close to her last chance to cut across to Highway 1, although she had fully intended to wind her way slowly up the magnificent Big Sur coast on that rugged scenic route and spend the night at Dijon's en route to Carmel. She felt suddenly tired and cold, while a powerful wave of homesickness overtook her. No, I must go home directly, she felt very strongly in her bones. She plowed ahead steadily and felt a degree of relief upon crossing the county line into Monterey. However, it would still be a good 2 hours before she would truly be home. She looked forward to a hot bath and an early bed, as she had never done before. The next morning, she was surprised to see the FedEx truck pull up in front of the house, and with what looked to be a delivery from her mother in Palm Springs. Her mother now preferred to spend most of the year, since her father's unexpected passing 10 years earlier, in the solitude of the desert, painting landscapes which she regularly sent home. Paloma would then notify her mother's many collectors, who eagerly bought them faster than the paint could dry. How strange, though, for this painting to arrive unannounced and by overnight ground delivery. Paloma signed for it and quickly got the box cutter. She was curious as to what could possibly require such urgency on her mother's part. As she carefully slipped the painting out of the box, her hands began to tremble, and for the second time in 48 hours she inhaled sharply while uttering in disbelief, Petal. Inside the box she found a letter from Gwen, and in it Gwen explained that she had had a profound realization on the morning of Paloma's departure. She said she had realized that Petal, in finding her, had really only found part of her way home, and she still had one major leg left to go in her journey. She had merely been resting at Dr. Cordero's house and getting her bearings. The sight of Paloma had reminded her of the direction in which she still had yet to continue. Love, after all, always returns to love, Gwen wrote in closing. Paloma hung the portrait of Petal at her bedside so she could drift off to sleep each night and awaken in the morning under Petal's watchful gaze, resting secure in the knowledge that the miraculous is never far away, as evidenced by the fact that Petal had indeed come home.